Watch this. We're going to talk about openings and closings for your presentations. This is the first thing that you do and the last thing that people remember. And so it's really important to get them right. And if you do it right, they're directly connected. And at the end of this video, as a little bonus, I'll show you how I did that little trick. Coming up. Hello there, friends. I'm Alex Lyon, and Communication Coach is here to help you increase your impact and lead your teams with higher levels of excellence. Presentation skills are a key way to distinguish your leadership. And the intro and conclusion are obviously key parts of this. A lot of times we don't get to the intro and the conclusion in terms of fine-tuning until after everything's done. And so it's really important that you work just a little extra on your opening and your closing to make sure you start and finish the way you want to. So I'm going to give you a little bit of philosophy and then some really concrete tips on the intro, and then we'll go to the conclusion. So first of all, in terms of philosophy, your introduction needs to do a few things. It needs to gain your audience's attention, pique their curiosity, and essentially make them want to listen to the rest of it. And if you do it right, you can do this very effectively. So I'm going to take what I describe as the funnel approach, where we go from general to specific. And by the end of your introduction, it's going to go right into the body points of your presentation really well. So it's going to have 5 parts where you grab the audience's attention, you give the relevance that the topic has to the audience, you establish your personal credibility, your thesis statement, and then a brief preview. So let's unpack each of these in a little more detail. The first step is to grab your audience's attention. In fact, I'm working on a whole separate series that's connected to this video, and I'll put the links below in time as I develop them on attention grabbers and the different nuances of sharing those. So I'm going to give a few samples here to get you started, but feel free to dig in deeper into each of those. So the first way to grab the audience's attention is to do it with rhetorical questions. These are questions that might involve the audience a little bit, but essentially don't need to be answered on the spot, but it'll pique everybody's curiosity. So you might say, for example, by a show of hands, how many of you have ever had a great boss? What is it that makes leaders great? And those are 2 questions put together that'll pique our interest. Rhetorical questions are a great way, and a very easy way, really. If you work at it, you can make them good and effective, but they're not a complicated way to get people interested in your topic. Another relatively easy way is to get a good quotation to start off your presentation that draws people in. Now, a good quotation to me goes to the heart of what your message is going to be in the body of your presentation, but essentially you're picking someone who said it just a little better than you knew how to say it. For example, I'll give you a couple of examples. Muhammad Ali once said, "Those who are not courageous enough to take risks will never accomplish anything in life." Now, you get a great quote from Muhammad Ali, and that quote can go toward, for example, playing sports naturally, or taking risks, or trying new things, or trying to achieve success. A good quote will really nail it. Another example of a quote is from a famous comedian, stand-up comic named George Burns. He did comedy until almost he was 100 years old. He was booked into his deep 90s doing stand-up comedy, if you can imagine. And he had a lot of jokes about aging and getting old, and about retirement and not wanting to retire. Anyway, as George Burns once said, "Retiring at age 65 is ridiculous. When I was 65, I still had pimples." So he's saying it so well. Maybe your talk is about not necessarily wanting to retire, but continue to be productive later in life, and that's a great way to start it. So quotations are an excellent way, if you find the right one and you set it up right, a great way to start a presentation. Another way is through some kind of visual illustration. Anything visual to communicate your message and grab people's attention and draw them in. I saw a recent speaker, in fact, she's a student speaker. I teach college in addition to doing consulting, but this was a student speaker, and she started off with something very visual. She had like a huge gift bag, and in the bag, for her attention grabber, she brought out one item at a time and described it a little bit, put it down, and one item at a time described it a little bit, and it was very visual. Each item said a little bit something about her just in that first 30 seconds of her presentation, and it made us really lean in and want to hear what she was going to say next. You could also use, as an easy way to do this, a visual slide of some sort, like on PowerPoint, maybe an image, a funny, a cute image, whatever it is that helps get to the heart of what you're trying to express. Another way to do this, grab people's attention, is through a startling fact or statistic. Again, this is all in the opening, just in the first 20 or 30 seconds of your presentation. In fact, I was looking into retirement planning recently, and here's a nice statistic I came across that might work well for a presentation on retirement planning. By age 65, most people only have $100,000 saved for retirement. Now, if that sounds like a lot, that would last you less than 3 years of expenses into your retirement. So there's a statistic that's relatively shocking. Most people only have $100,000. Now again, that does sound like a lot, but you tease out the statistic a little bit and it makes people want to hear what you're going to say. If you're going to do something on retirement planning, for example, well, now I am very interested in hearing what comes next. Another way to do this is through a brief story. A lot of times stories can get too long-winded, but if you can tell a 30-second story that really captures the essence of what you're going to share later, then it can be a wonderful way to start. Everybody loves stories. I was watching a speaker once talk about donating to food pantries, and he started off with about a 30-second story describing a family's journey to America. They immigrated here and they got by in part on the help from food pantries in their local area for the first couple of years while they got on their feet, and it really personalized the message he was sharing and made me want to listen. Another student speaker I saw was talking about cleanliness around the house and how you don't need big expensive products to do effective cleaning. And she started with a story about a guy named Thomas Crapper. If the name sounds familiar, he made some key improvements to the flushable toilet back in the day, and that was a really engaging story, had a little humor to it. So these are some ways that you can have that first step in the overall funnel from general to specific, is that attention grabber. And that can be somewhat general, even though it's going to the heart of the message. The next step to get a little more specific is talk about the specific benefits that this particular audience is going to get by listening to your message. And this is not easy, actually. You have to work this out. You have to put yourself in the minds of your listeners. Think, why would they want to care? And in 2 to 3 sentences, you want to spell out exactly what they get out of this at the end, how they personally benefit. Maybe they walk away with a concrete retirement plan that they can use and put into practice. That's a good benefit. Maybe they walk away with really specific strategies for cleaning around the house on a budget. That's great. So the next step is to establish your personal credibility. In some situations, when you're introduced by other people, they'll do this for you and you won't have to. However, if you haven't been introduced or haven't been introduced adequately, you want to, in about 2 to 3 sentences, really concise, talk about your personal experience and connection with the topic, as well as any research above and beyond that you have done. And I've seen this done very effectively in just 2 to 3 sentences. You share why you are the one speaking on it. Why not someone else? Why is it you? And you answer that question for people. The 4th step is your thesis statement. Some people call this the central idea. Other people call it the main idea of your presentation. And you want to handle this as concisely as possible. This is the one sentence you really want to pop out of your introduction. You should pause right before it and right after it. Make sure it sinks in. It should be about one concise sentence, and it should be your claim, your argument, the main point. If they remember nothing else, how would you boil it down into one sentence? And that'll be that theme that runs through your presentation all the way. It can be a very powerful and memorable sentence if you craft it right. And the last part of this funnel of introduction is even more specific, and that's the preview of the main points that you're going to share. So usually you have 3 or so main points. I recommend keeping this preview very brief. If you can pare your main points down to single words or very brief phrases, you're going to be better off. Don't get into any detail. So let's say you're talking about retirement planning. You would say, I'm going to talk about individual retirement accounts, 401ks, and Social Security. Little pause, little beat between each one, and it clearly forecasts what you're going to talk about in your main points of the body of the presentation. So those are the main parts of an opening of a presentation, with a lot of emphasis on the attention grabbers, because that's usually the part that is key, but you have to connect it to the rest of this introduction for it to make the most sense for your audience. And now we're going to transition to talk about your conclusion and show how this can be directly connected, if you do it right, to your introduction. You're at the point in your presentation where you've done your introduction, you've done your body, the main points, and now you're ready to conclude. So let's unpack this conclusion and especially that last closing part of the presentation. So the first thing you need to do in your conclusion is signal the end. You have to say in conclusion or something along those lines. In closing, in summary, to wrap things up. Now a lot of people push back on this. I don't want to say that. It sounds so typical. Isn't there some other way to say this? Well, you're welcome to try, but I can tell you it's okay. Even high-level speakers, even the President of the United States, sometimes at the end of a presentation will say in conclusion, because it's a really clear signal that you're ending. Even though it might feel a little bit wooden or robotic when it comes out of your mouth, it's really good for your listeners. They want to know that you're shutting it down, you're coming to a close, and that's the clearest signal you can give. There are a couple of ways to express this, but you have to say it really cleanly. This only takes a few words though. So that's the first part, is signaling the end of the presentation. The next thing you want to do is reinforce the main point. If they missed it in the intro, if they missed it throughout the body of the presentation, this is your last chance to emphasize the main takeaway point of your presentation, your thesis. You can also, as an add-on to this, summarize your main points again. Maybe it's the kind of presentation where people would benefit from hearing you delineate your 3 main points again. Sometimes it's not necessary depending upon your message. Sometimes it really helps. The next step is to give your call to action. A lot of times in a presentation where there's a persuasive element to it, you want people to take some concrete action, and this is where to spell it out. You have to tell them exactly what you recommend they do next. And this is going to be different depending upon the topic, depending upon the audience, depending upon you, the situation, everything. So there's no real way to give you a boilerplate solution, but I will say to avoid this common thing that people do. I've heard this a million times and it always is lame. People will say, so the next time you find yourself blank, and then they tell you to remember what you said. Well, this so the next time has got to go. If you're doing a presentation and you're in front of me and you say, so the next time, I can tell you right now, I'm not doing whatever, you've already lost me. And a lot of speakers do this because they didn't work hard enough at this closing, this call to action. So you have to figure out an appropriate and doable call to action that you can spell out exactly there in concrete fashion. And the very last thing you should do, what most people call the closing of the presentation, is the final clincher, where you end on a high note. I call it a clincher. Other people call it other things like a closing. And this is where you can really do some magic. You're going to connect the opening attention grabber to your clincher, to your closing. So if you started off with a story in your opening, you want to echo that story, maybe even tell a little bit more of it in your closing. If you start off with a quotation, bring that quotation back around. You started off with some kind of illustration, you bring that illustration back around. Boy, do audiences love it. It's very psychologically satisfying for people to call back what they did in the beginning. It's like a comedian will have a good punchline toward the beginning, and then later on in the same routine, they'll call back that punchline and they get a big laugh again. There's a sense of closure, sense of satisfaction that you have really buttoned up this whole idea and it's come full circle. So the person presenting about the food pantries that I mentioned in the attention grabber, the story they told, they finished a little bit more of the story and revealed that it was in fact their family. He was talking about himself in this opening story and how his family helped get by on the first couple of years in the United States because of the help of food pantries. The person who had the bag of objects as an illustration, pulling out objects, talking about her identity, later on held up the open bag and talked about the kinds of things that she wanted in the future to put into the bag to help define who she was and move forward in her life in that next chapter. The person who told the story about Thomas Crapper, the person who helped innovate improvements on the toilet, she brought that story back around and used a little humor to talk about, you never know, maybe our family name could be known again and we could be the next Thomas Crapper. I mean, that was a really great way to end it on a high note. Everybody loved it. It takes a little art, it takes a little skill, But working hard at that attention grabber in the beginning will help set up your clincher at the end. And that's what you should be doing when you're looking at a great opening and a great closing. Now, a couple of other little quick tips. Once you're done, zip that mouth. You want to be silent, smile, nod, and say thank you. That's all. And then pause for 2 seconds and walk off. You're done. Do not say, that's it, so that's all I have to say, okay. You want to be practicing your ending the whole time. Every time you practice your presentation, practice that ending where you zip your mouth, smile, nod, say thank you, and that's all you say, 2 seconds, and you walk off. Don't multiply words at the end. It's going to really ruin a great presentation. So there's the tips for the opening and the closing and how they can be directly connected. Make sure you watch for a few more moments to see how I did that magic trick with the red ball. That's my opening and my closing. And I would love to hear your comments below. Question of the day. What are your tips for strong openings and closings? Put those in the comment section below so everybody else can benefit from your experience. So thanks, God bless, and I hope the next opening and closing for your next presentation is out of this world. Watch this. No. Watch this. Whoa, whoa. Hey guys, it's the wand. That is nuts.